History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 4, The Closing of an Era. Frustrations. The 1980s were to bring startling changes, but few in the Middle East, where, as the decade began, they seemed more likely. Instead, a fundamental stagnation seemed to hang over the region. Tension had been high there in the 1980s, as it had been for years, and so were the hopes of most interested parties about resolving the problems presented by Israel's appearance as a successor state to the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. Except perhaps among a minority of Israelis, these hopes were to be gravely disappointed. For a time, it had looked as if the Iranian Revolution might transform the rules of the game played hitherto, and some had indeed hoped so. 10 years later, though, it would still be very difficult to say what it had actually changed outside Iran, or what was the true significance of the uproar in the Islamic world that it had provoked. What had looked for a time like an Islamic resurgence could also be seen as merely one of the recurrent waves of Puritanism, which have formed from time to time across the centuries, stimulated and regenerated the faithful. Clearly, too, tension owed much to circumstance. Israel's occupation of the third of Islamic's holy places in Jerusalem had suddenly enhanced the sense of Islamic solidarity. Yet the attack by Iraq on Iran in 1980 led to a bloody war lasting 8 years and costing a million lives. Whatever else might have been behind it, it also mattered in that conflict that Iraq was Sunni, Iran Shiite. Once more, Islamic peoples were divided along ancient fault lines as well as by contemporary issues. It soon appeared too that although it could irritate and alarm the superpowers, the USSR, especially because of its millions of Muslim subjects, Iran could not thwart them. At the end of 1979, its rulers had to watch helplessly when a Russian army went into Afghanistan to prop up a puppet communist regime there against Muslim rebels. One reason why the Iranians backed terrorists and kidnappers was that that was the best or worst they could do. Nor, in spite of their success over the American hostages, could they get the former Shah back to face Islamic justice. By successfully tweaking the eagle's tail's feathers in the hostage affair, Iran had humiliated the United States, but this soon seemed much less important than it did at the time. In retrospect, a declaration by President Carter in 1980 that the United States regarded the Persian Gulf as an area of vital interest revealed more of the future. It was an early sign of the ending of the exaggerated mood of American uncertainty and defeatism. A central reality of international politics was about to reassert itself. For all the dramatic changes since the Cuban crisis, the American Republic was still in 1980 one of only two states whose might gave them unquestioned status as, to use an official Soviet definition, greatest world powers, without whose participation not a single international problem can be solved. This participation, in some instances, would be implicit rather than explicit, but it was a fundamental datum of the way the world worked. History, moreover, has no favorites for long. Although some Americans had been frightened by Soviet strength after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were plentiful signs by the early 1970s that the Soviet rulers were in difficulties. They had to face a truism that Marxism itself proclaimed. Its consciousness evolves with material conditions. Two results, among others. of real but limited relaxation in Soviet society were an evident dissidence, trivial in scale but suggesting a growing demand for greater spiritual freedom, and a less explicit but real groundswell of opinion that further material gains should be forthcoming. The Soviet Union nevertheless continued to spend colossal sums on armaments, about a quarter of its GDP in the 1980s. Yet these could hardly suffice, it appeared. To carry even this burden, Western technology, management techniques, and possibly capital would be needed. What change might follow on that was debatable, but that there would be change was certain. However, by 1980, there had grown even stronger the most compelling tie between the two superpowers. For all the huge effort by the Soviet Union to give themselves greater nuclear striking power over the United States, superiority at such a level is a somewhat national matter. Americans, with their gift for the arresting slogan, concisely summed up the situation as mad. That is to say, both countries had the capacity to produce mutually assured destruction, or more precisely, a situation in which each of the two potential combatants had enough striking power to ensure that, even if a surprise attack deprived it of the cream of its weapons, what remained would be sufficient to ensure a reply so appalling as to turn its opponents' cities into smoking wilderness and leave its armed forces capable of little but attempting to control the terrorized survivors. This bizarre possibility was a great conservative force, even if madmen, to simply put this matter, are occasionally to be found in seats of power. Dr. Johnson's observation that the knowledge that you are to be hanged wonderfully concentrates the mind is applicable to collectivities threatened with disasters on this scale. The knowledge that a blunder may be followed by extinction is a great stimulus to prudence. Here may well lie the most fundamental explanation of a new degree of cooperation, which had already been shown in the 1970s by the United States and the Soviet Union in spite of their specific quarrels. A 1972 treaty on defensive missile limitation had been one of its first fruits. It owed something to a new awareness on both sides that science could now monitor infringements of such agreements. Not only military research made for an increase of tension. In the following year, talks began on further arms limitations, while another set of discussions began to explore the possibility of a comprehensive security arrangement in Europe in return for the implicit recognition of Europe's post-war frontiers, above all, that between of the two Germanys. The Soviet negotiators had finally agreed in 1975 at Helsinki to increase economic intercourse between Eastern and Western Europe and to sign a guarantee of human rights and political freedom. The last was, of course, unenforceable, yet it may well have had more importance than the symbolic gains of frontier recognition to which the Soviet negotiators had attached much significance. Western success over human rights was not only to prove a great encouragement to dissidents in communist Europe and Russia, but sidestepped old restraints on what had been deemed interference in the internal affairs of communist states. Gradually, there began to arise public criticisms that were, in the end, to help to bring about change in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the flow of trade and investment between the two Europes began almost at once to increase, though also very slowly. It was the nearest approach so far to a general peace treaty ending the Second World War, and it gave the Soviet Union what its leaders most desired: assurance of security of the territorial settlement that was one of the major spoils of victory in 1945. For all that, Americans were very worried about world affairs as 1980, the year of a presidential election, approached. 18 years before, the Cuban crisis had shown the world that the United States was top dog. It had then enjoyed superiority in military strength, the usually dependable support of allies, clients, and satellites the world over, and the public will to sustain a world diplomatic and military effort while grappling with huge domestic problems. By 1980, many of its citizens felt the world had changed and were unhappy about it. When the new Republican president, Ronald Reagan, took office in 1981, his supporters looked back on the decade of what seemed increasing American powerlessness. He inherited an enormous budgetary deficit, disappointment over what looked like recent advances by Soviet power in Africa and Afghanistan, and dismay over what was believed to be the disappearance of an American superiority in nuclear weapons enjoyed in the 1960s. Middle East issues. In the next 5 years, President Reagan surprised his critics. He was to restore the morale of his countrymen by remarkable, even if often cosmetic feats of leadership. Symbolically, on the day of his inauguration, the Iranians released their American hostages. Many Americans believed the timing of the release to have been stage managed by the new administration's supporters. But this was by no means the end of the troubles the United States faced in the Middle East and the Gulf. Two fundamental difficulties did not go away: the threat posed to international order in that area, while Cold War attitudes endured, and the question of Israel. The war between Iran and Iraq was evidently of the first danger, many people thought. Soon, the instability of some Arab countries became more obvious. Ordered government virtually disappeared in the Lebanon, which collapsed into an anarchy disputed by bands of gunmen patronized by the Syrians and Iranians, as this gave the revolutionary wing of the PLO an even more promising base for operation than in the past. Israel took to increasingly violent and expensive military operations on and beyond her northern borders. There followed in the 1980s a heightening of tension and even more vicious Israeli Palestinian conflict. Most alarming still to Americans, Lebanon descended into an anarchy in which, following the arrival of the United States Marines, bombs exploded at the American embassy and its Marines barracks, killing over 300 people in all. The United States was not alone in being troubled by these enduring ills. When the Soviet Union sent its soldiers to Afghanistan, where they were to stay bogged down for most of the next decade, Iranian and Muslim anger elsewhere was bound to affect Muslims inside the Soviet Union. Some thought this a hopeful sign, believing the growing confusion of the Islamic world might induce caution on the part of the two superpowers and perhaps lead to less unconditional support for their satellites and allies in the region. This mattered most, of course, to Israel. Meanwhile, the more alarming manifestations and rhetoric of the Iranian Revolution made some think that a conflict of civilizations was beginning. Iran's aggression, Puritanism, though, also caused shivers among conservative Arabs and in the oil rich kingdoms of the Gulf, above all, Saudi Arabia. There were indeed numerous signs of what looked like spreading sympathy for the radical reactionaries of the Iranian Revolution in other Islamic countries. Some of them murdered the president of Egypt in 1981. The government of Pakistan continued to proclaim and impose its Islamic orthodoxy and winked at assistance to the anti communist rebels in Afghanistan. Although uniquely among Islamic countries, it had by the end of the decade accepted a woman as prime minister and even in 1989 rejoined the British Commonwealth. North Africa presented more alarming evidence of radical Islamic feeling as the decade advanced, less importantly, in the bizarre sallies and pronouncements of the excited dictator of Libya. Colonel Gaddafi called upon other oil producing states to stop supplying the United States, while one third of the Libyan oil continued to find a market there, and in 1980 briefly united his country to the Ba'athist Syria. Then in Algeria. That country had made a promising start after winning its independence, but by 1980, its economy was flagging. The consensus that had sustained the independence movement was crumbling, and immigration to look for work in Europe seemed the only outlet available for the energies of many of its young men. In the 1990 Algerian elections, an Islamic fundamentalist party won a majority of votes for the first time in any Arab country. In the previous year, a military coup in Sudan had brought a military and militant Islamic regime to power there that at once suppressed the few remaining civic freedoms of the people of that unhappy land. Nonetheless, for all the attractions of Islamic radicalization, there were plentiful signs by 1990 that moderate and conservative Arab politicians were antagonized enough for indigenous opposition to the fundamentalists sometimes to be effective. It remains hard to believe that the sufficient leverage is available to the would be revolutionaries. Even after setting aside both such political realities and deeper questions about the feasibility of successful Islamic revolution, when so many of its would be supporters still seek, unknowingly, to realize goals of power and modernization systematically incompatible with Islamic teaching and custom. Libya could destabilize other African countries and arm Irish terrorists, but achieved little else. Because of preoccupations with changing circumstances elsewhere, the old Soviet American rivalry was decreasingly available for exploitation. All that was left for the fundamentalists to look to were two potentially rich Muslim countries, Iraq and Iran. And for most of the 1980s, they were fatally entangled in a costly struggle with one another. There was also growing evidence that the ruler of Iraq, patronized by the Americans and the major troublemaker of the Middle East, was only tactically and pragmatically a supporter of Islam. Saddam Hussein was a Muslim by upbringing but led a formally secular Ba'athist regime actually based on patronage, family, and self interest of soldiers. He sought power and technological modernization as a way to it. And there is no evidence that the welfare of the Iraqi people ever concerned him. When he launched his war on Iran, the prolongation of the struggle and the evidence of its costs were greeted with relief by other Arab states, notably the other Arab oil producers of the Gulf, because it appeared at the time to pin down both a dangerous bandit and the Iranian revolutionaries whom they feared. It was, however, less pleasing to them that the war distracted attention from the cause of the Palestinian question and unquestionably made it easier for Israel to deal with the PLO. During nearly a decade of alarms and excursions in the Gulf, some of which raised the specter of further interference with Western oil suppliers. Incidents seemed at times to threaten a widening armed conflict, notably between Iran and the United States. Meanwhile, Events in the Levant embittered the stalemate there. Israel's continuing occupation of the Golan Heights, her vigorous operations in Lebanon against Palestinian guerrilla bands and their patrons, and her government's encouragement of further Jewish immigration, notably from the USSR, all helped to buttress her against the day when she might once again face united Arab armies. At the end of 1987, however, there came the first outbreaks of violence among Palestinians in the Israeli occupied territories. They persisted and grew into an intermittent but what would prove enduring insurrection, the Intifada. The PLO, despite winning further international sympathy by officially recognizing Israel's own right to exist, was nonetheless in a disadvantaged position in 1989 when the Iraq Iran war finally ended. In the following year, the Ayatollah Khomeini died, and there were signs that his successor might be less adventurous in support of the Palestinian and the fundamentalist Islamic causes. During the Iraq Iran War, the United States had favored Iraq, in part because of American exaggeration of the fundamentalist threat. When nevertheless the Americans found themselves at last face to face at war in the Gulf with the declared enemy, it was with the Iraqis, not the Iranians, in 1990. After making a generous peace with Iran, Saddam Hussein took up an old border dispute with the Sheikhdom of Kuwait. He had also quarreled with its ruler over oil quotas and prices. It is not easy to believe in the reality of these grievances, whatever they may have meant symbolically to Hussein himself. What seems to have moved him most was a simple determination to seize the immense oil wealth of Kuwait. During the summer of 1990, his threats increased. Then, on 2nd August, the armies of Iraq invaded Kuwait and in a few hours subdued it. There followed a remarkable mobilization of world opinion against Iraq in the UN. Hussein sought to play both the Islamic and the Arab cards by confusing the pursuit of his own predatory ambitions with Arab hatred for Israel. Demonstrations of support for him in the streets of Middle Eastern cities proved of very low value. Only the PLO and Jordan spoke up for him officially. No doubt to his shocked surprise, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Egypt actually became partners in the improbable alliance that rapidly formed against him. Almost equally surprising to him must have been the acquiescence of the USSR in what followed. Most startling of all, the United Nations Security Council produced with overwhelming majorities a series of resolutions condemning Iraq's action and finally authorizing the use of force against her to ensure the liberation of Kuwait. Huge forces were assembled in Saudi Arabia under American command. On 16th January 1991, they went into action. Within a month, Iraq gave in and withdrew after suffering considerable loss. Allied casualties were insignificant. Yet this humiliation did not obviously threaten Hussein's survival. Once again, the turning point in the Middle East that so many had longed for had not arrived. The war disappointed both Arab revolutionaries and Western would be peacemakers. The greatest losers were the PLO, and Israel was the greatest gainer. Arab military success at her expense was inconceivable for the near future. Yet, at the end of another war of the Ottoman succession, the Israel problem was still there. Syria and Iran had already, before the Kuwait crisis, begun to show signs that, for their own reasons, they intended to make attempts to get a negotiated settlement. But whether one would emerge was another matter, even if for the United States it was clearly more of a priority than ever to get one. Perhaps it was an advance that The alarming specter of a radical and fundamentalist pan Islamic movement had been for a long time dissipated. For practical purposes, had again proved a mirage. For all the distress, unrest, and discontent with which many Muslims faced the West, there was virtually no sign that their resentments could yet be coordinated in an effective response, and less than ever that they would do without the subtly corrosive means of modernization that the West offered. Almost incidentally, too, crisis in the Gulf appeared to reveal that the oil weapon had lost much of its power to damage the developed world. For though one had been feared, there was no new oil crisis. Against this background, in 1991, American diplomacy at last persuaded Arabs and Israelis again to take part in a conference on the Middle East. Détente. Great transformation had meanwhile taken place elsewhere, and they also bore up events in the Middle East. Yet they did so only because they shaped what the USA and USSR did there. In 1979 to 1980, the American presidential election campaign had deliberately been used to exploit the public's fears of the Soviet Union. Unsurprisingly, this reawoke animosity at the official level. The conservative leaders of the Soviet Union showed renewed suspicion of the trend of United States policy. It seemed likely that promising steps towards disarmament might be swept aside, or even worse. In the event, the American administration came to show a new pragmatism in foreign affairs, while on the Soviet side, internal change was to open the way to greater flexibility. One landmark was the death in November 1982 of Leonid Brezhnev, Khrushchev's successor and for 18 years General Secretary of the party. His immediate replacement, the head of the KGB, soon died, and a septuagenarian, whose own death followed even more quickly, succeeded him before there came to the office of the General Secretary in 1985, the youngest member of the Politburo, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was 54. Virtually the whole of his political experience had been of the post Stalin era. His impact upon his country's and the world's history was to be remarkable. The conjunction of forces that propelled Gorbachev to the succession remains unclear. The KGB presumably did not oppose his promotion, and his first acts and speeches were orthodox, although he had already in the previous year made an impression on the British Prime Minister as someone with whom business could be done. He soon articulated a new political tone. The word communism was heard less in his speeches, and socialism was reinterpreted to exclude egalitarianism, though from time to time he reminded his colleagues that he was a communist. For want of a better term, his aim was seen by many foreigners as liberalization, which was an inadequate Western attempt to sum up two Russian words he used a great deal: nost, openness, and troika, restructuring. The implications of the new course were to be profound and dramatic, and for the remainder of the decade, Gorbachev grappled with them. What actually happened cannot have been in his mind when he started out. No doubt he saw that without radical change, the Soviet economy could not provide the USSR with its former military might, sustain its commitments to the Allies, improve, however slowly and modestly, living standards at home, and assure continuing self generated technological advance. Accordingly, Gorbachev seemed to seek to avoid the collapse of the communism by opening it to his own vision of Leninism, above all by making it a more pluralist system and by involving the intelligentsia in the political nation. The possible implication of such a change, of course, seems to have been concealed even from himself. Essentially, it was an admission that the 70 years experiment in arriving at modernization through socialism had failed. Neither freedom nor material well being had been forthcoming, and now the costs were becoming too heavy to bear. Ronald Reagan was soon drawing dividends on Gorbachev's assumption of office. That Soviet policy was reflecting a new tone soon became clear in their meetings. Discussions of arm reduction was renewed. Agreements were reached on other issues. In America's domestic politics, a huge and still growing budgetary deficit and a flagging economy, which would under most presidents have produced political uproar, were for years virtually lost to sight in the euphoria produced by a seeming transformation of the international scene. The alarm and fear with which the evil empire of the Soviet Union was regarded by many Americans began to evaporate a little. Optimism and confidence grew as the USSR showed signs of growing division and difficulty in reforming its affairs. While Americans were promised wonders by their government in the shape of new defensive measures in space. Though thousands of scientists said the project was unrealistic, the Soviet government could not face the costs of competing with that. Americans were heartened too in 1986 when American bombers were launched from England on a punitive mission against Libya, whose unbalanced ruler had been supporting anti American terrorists. President Reagan was less successful, though, in convincing many of his countrymen that more enthusiastic assertions of American interests in Central America were truly to their advantage. But he remained remarkably popular. Only after he had left office did it begin to draw that the decade had been one in which the gap between rich and poor in the United States had widened even further. In 1987, the fruits of negotiations on arms control were gathered in an agreement over intermediate range nuclear missiles. In spite of so many shocks and its erosion by the emergence of new foci of power, the nuclear balance had held long enough for the first stand downs by the superpowers. They at least, if not other countries seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, appeared to have recognized that nuclear war, if it came, held out the prospect of virtual extinction for mankind and were beginning to do something about it. In 1991, there were to be further dramatic developments as the United States and USSR agreed to major reductions in existing weapons stocks.